all you Nightmare nerds, and welcome to our latest episode of Nightmare Revisited. Today, we will be talking about the film that launched 1,000 duplicates and put the found footage genre in the forefront of the horror landscape. That's right, today we discuss the Blair Witch Project. Although there were found footage predecessors to the Blair Witch, such as The Last Broadcast, The McPherson Tape, and the infamous Cannibal Holocaust, the genre had never experienced anywhere near as successful a film, and likely never will again. The Blair Witch Project shattered box office records by accruing $248 million worldwide against a $60,000 production budget. The industry at the time had never seen anything that substantial, and the film found itself in the world record books at the highest box office ratio ever recorded. So what was it about the film that made it so successful? I remember when it first came out, and without hyperbole, everybody was talking about it. I was around 8 years old at the time, and even though my parents let me watch almost anything I wanted, they would not take me near the Blair Witch. This drove me bonkers. All of my older siblings had seen it, kids at my school had seen it, everyone was talking about it. And why? Because everybody thought that it was real. I know this seems like a far-fetched idea, and you likely don't believe that anyone actually thought the Blair Witch was real, but that's where you're wrong. The real success and legacy of the Blair Witch Project comes from the fact that the filmmakers revolutionized digital marketing to promote the film. Real missing person pages were created on the internet. There was an additional faux documentary chronicling the history of the made-up entity known as the Blair Witch. Fake newspaper articles were published online chronicling the events leading up to the film. And this was all being done at a time where our generation was really only just starting to understand what the internet was and how it could be used. So yes, there were people who thought it was real, and 8-year-old me was one of them. Welcome everyone to Nightmare Revisited. So this one's a little bit different for Nightmare Revisited because typically what we try to do is each person picks a movie and then the other person kind of goes back and forth with them. But this was something that we had both agreed on. And I find that pretty interesting. We both had a really profound effect. This movie has had a profound effect on us. So why don't you go first? Why don't you tell me the first time you saw this movie, how it came to be, what kind of effect it had on you?
Yeah, so this one's interesting. I distinctly remember seeing this one in the theaters. I was 19, or no, I wasn't 19. I was 14. It's a little bit of a difference. Yeah, it's a little bit of a difference. It was opening day, and I saw the matinee. So I saw it
oh, very cool.
I don't know what it was, like a 1:00 showing or something like that, which is
so. Yeah, I don't really remember I was younger than you at the time, so I don't really remember the release of this movie. I remember it growing big because of word of mouth, but like the day it came out, were you like looking at it? Like how did you first hear about it?
So I was obsessing over it before it even came out. I was like all into the website. I was checking the website frequently. I was like,
which was a huge part of the movie, which
exactly.
We'll talk about.
Yeah.
This viral marketing. That
buying into the lore, if you will.
Yeah.
That weekend, I know I was going up to my cottage because it was a summer release. I think it was like late July. We had a family cottage. I was going up there with a friend that weekend, and I like convinced him to like forego going up to the cottage early to go see the Blair Witch Project with me. He complied. He's a good friend. I remember he bought the Red Hot Chili Peppers' Californication on CD after we saw the movie. Quick side note, continue. Bad decision. So I just remember being like totally obsessed with it ahead of time, not being disappointed watching it. I think I saw it another 3 times in the theater after that. Yeah. Unfortunately, I was never able to see it in the theater, which was kind of a bummer. Like I said, I was a lot younger at the time. The first time I had seen it, my dad had rented it, which was kind of weird because my dad was never shy about taking me to see R-rated movies or letting me watch them. I think at a young age, he definitely understood what the kind of person I was going to be when I grew up. My dad used to take me to see whatever, and I grew up on Godzilla movies, so like really monster movies and stuff. It was all the thing in our household, but he wouldn't take me to see Blair Witch, which was really interesting, considering that when it came out on VHS, he rented it and let everybody watch it, including me and my 2 sisters who did not want to watch it. I remember sitting in the living room with everybody, including my mom, and watching this movie, and we were all
all terrified.
Yeah.
It's a very visceral experience the first time that you watch it because you really don't know where it's going.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. That's so funny that you say that about your dad, because my dad, and as we'll get into with a lot of these podcasts,
For sure.
my dad was also showing me movies that I shouldn't have seen at ages that I shouldn't have seen them at.
What do you think the worst movie your dad let you watch was before you were ready for it?
I would honestly, it's my favorite movie of all time. I would honestly say it was The Shining.
Really?
And I had to get him to turn it off. It was that, like, it's traumatic for me.
So we will be doing an episode of The Shining very shortly on here, but the first time I saw The Shining was actually my grandfather. He had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of VHS tapes, and he had a catalog system. None of them were purchased, they were all recorded. So you had to like go into his catalog, find which tape you wanted, and then it would give you start time so you could go to the separate rewinder and fast forwarder, and and then you could find what you want. And he had a huge ledger alphabetically that was logged to the catalog, and that's the first time I saw The Shining, which was funny. But
I love that.
Yeah, I probably, that had a huge influence on me as a kid, because I used to just watch all kinds of horror movies that I was not supposed to watch because my grandparents didn't really know. My grandfather would just record everything like on cable. But I think the worst for me was probably Hollow Man. I think I was like 9 when I saw Hollow Man, and there's a lot of graphic content to that movie that I should not have seen at a young age.
That's not a 9-year-old movie.
No, it is not for
or a movie for 9-year-olds.
Yeah, in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
But so be it. But getting back to the Blair Witch, so that first time I had seen it, I felt like I was watching something really special. Even at a young age, it really stood out to me. And part of, I kind of understood this more growing older, but part of it was the viral marketing of this movie that kind of took the movie industry by storm, because it was something that wasn't being done before. So, and being old enough to remember that and following that up online, maybe you could talk about, what you were seeing and how it was affecting you and how it kind of drove you to see this movie.
Yeah. So it was such the early stages of like actually having an internet connection, right? Like, right. There are two very specific things that I remember back then, is that, like, because I was obsessed with horror even at that age, but I was big into like just like like whatever Google was at the time, like searching for things that kind of dove deep into movies and into horror movies specifically. Like, I remember, if you've seen the documentary Room 237, I remember reading those like conspiracy theories
before
online,
it was even
and just like loving the movies that much more, just because I was able to do all that research. But
sure,
with that website in particular, I think it was because I'd read about it on film sites. I don't know if I necessarily knew that it was fake. I think I kind of bought into the idea that it was real, and I think the website was kind of this, this other step in it becoming sort of like this like urban legend or whatever. Just getting like big into it that way.
Yeah, because I think part of the great thing about this movie and why it was so unique, and obviously it was really the dawn of the found footage horror movie, right? You certainly had ones before this, like, Cannibal Holocaust, and The Last Broadcast is largely attributed as the first desktop feature, but it was really the Blair Witch that skyrocketed the genre into popularity. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because at the time we really had never seen anything like it, and the collective audience really, really wanted this to be real. Like, we wanted to be able to say that we had seen something in the theater that we weren't supposed to see, right?
Yeah, even just recently I was reading that Heather's mom was getting cards in the mail because people thought that her daughter died in the woods. That's wild.
Right. Yeah, and this is really all attributed to this viral marketing that's largely attributed to Blair Witch that was not seen before, largely because the directors, I think, understood the channel of the internet way before it was being used the way it is today. And, they were doing this by, they produced an independent documentary, independent from, supposedly from this production, about what the Blair Witch was, to make, because it's not a real urban legend, right? Mm-hmm. But I think part of the genius of this movie is that it's real to us, because each area of the United States has that urban legend. So I grew up in South Jersey, and we had, aside from the Jersey Devil, which is a whole other thing, but we had this thing called the Atco Ghost, where there was this town. It's deep in the boonies of New Jersey, and there's a dirt road that goes into the woods, into the Pine Barrens. And they say that if you turn off your car, flick your lights 3 times, you see a boy bouncing his basketball back and forth across the road, right? Okay. And so I remember seeing the Blair Witch and thinking to myself, well, now I got to go get my dad's camcorder and go out to Atco and make my own, because everybody has that urban legend, so it was so believable. Yep. To see the Blair Witch and be like, well, obviously that's a real urban legend. Like, it's so obvious. Yeah. Did you have any urban legends?
There was one in a nearby town that was, the claim was that there was somebody who got beheaded on a road on their motorcycle. And so
that's a dark one.
Yeah. And people would go to this site and there was always people talking about how they found wire across from one tree to another across the road and things like that. But nothing really that urban legendy. We lived near a psychiatric hospital that was shut down, so that was a place that I took my video camera that I got gifted to me.
That's awesome. Do you still have that footage?
No, I don't, and I wish I did. We also got pulled over by the cops on that particular trip, and the cop was asking me, legitimately asking me to erase the footage that we'd taken and things.
Oh my goodness.
Like that. Yeah, it was a whole thing. But
that would have been something really fun to look back to later and upload 10 years later.
Yeah.
That'd be
sure,
really cool.
For sure. So back to the Blair Witch. I know when we're going to get into this further too, with your love of found footage.
It's a love-hate relationship for sure.
I'm not as in love with found footage horror as you are, but I like it.
Sure.
And I think it's probably because I was so obsessed with the Blair Witch Project, and I feel like it's still the benchmark staple of the genre, even though it was people claimed it to be the first one. So I guess touch on that a little bit. How do you feel about it?
So you can definitely make an argument that the found footage genre hit its peak with Blair Witch. And, before coming back on here and talking about it, we had both rewatched it. And it's still the same kind of experience as the first time, in that I think it ages really well.
Oh, absolutely.
And it benefits the same way that Jaws benefits. And we've had discussions about Steven Spielberg, but I think Jaws holds up really well too, because the less you see, the more terrified you are.
Sharks will always be scary.
And especially for us, camera junkies, that little shadow at the edge of the screen, that thing that someone's looking at that you can't see, that's always more scary. And we will talk about this more in our found footage genres podcast, but it really is a genre that benefits from the less is more, because it lets your imagination run wild. And and there are very few that do it as well as Blair Witch, which is ironic because it also happened out of necessity, right? They were making this movie for pennies on the dollar, and they were asking themselves, how do we make something like this scary? And I think the filmmakers had this realization that it's scary if the viewer makes it scary. That it's kind of an audience as the worker kind of mentality, where the filmmakers relied on us to make this scary because it allowed our imaginations to run wild, because we have these inherent survival type tropes that are always going on in our head. For one, we're afraid of being lost in the woods, right? Nobody wants to get lost in the woods. Since the beginning of time, we've been terrified of being lost in the woods. We have the urban legend aspect to it. So it's all these things that kind of make it real to the viewer, and that really benefits the film itself. I personally believe Blair Witch is probably the best found footage movie ever made, and I don't think it can be replicated because you'll never be able to reach that level of this is real ever again, mostly because of how the internet has evolved, right? Yeah. Because you're able to fact check things so quickly now to be like, well, that's not real.
It's clearly fake. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Where the Blair Witch was using this tool before we really understood it to set off a mania. Like I remember in film school, one of my cohort lived around. I don't know if it's the same. It's actually called that town. I think it is. I think it's a real town. Burkittsville. Yeah, she lived in Burkittsville and was telling us about how that summer it was insane. People were flocking there, stealing road signs, like asking people about the Blair Witch, and the people there had to be like, it's not real.
Yeah, get out of our little town and leave our signs alone.
There was such a mania going on around that. I feel like there was a lot of mania in general going on around the 1999. Yeah, like Blair Witch and Pokemon probably could have took over the world at that time. Yeah, things were a little crazy back then, and we were ready to believe anything. So I don't think that you can get better than Blair Witch and found footage based on that fact alone. However, something that we will be talking about in our found footage podcast is how the genre of found footage evolves with each iteration of technology, which I think is really interesting. So if you guys are liking this discussion, make sure to check out our found footage genres podcast when that airs a little bit later this month.
100%. Yeah. I also think too, touching on the mania a little bit real quick. Sure. I lived in my parents' basement, the home that I grew up in, and the walls and the main section where I hung out with friends and stuff like that was just exposed drywall. Mm-hmm. And I remember drawing the Blair Witch stick figure symbol all over it,
which is terrifying to this day. Every time they find that little stick figure, it's so scary. And we've also talked about this. We're not really touching on the sequels that much today because they're mostly really bad. But the Blair Witch sequel, not Book of Shadows, but the Adam Wingard film that came out that tried to pick up the found footage again. The one scene that terrifies me is when they open their tents and they see all of it's covered in those stick figures because they're still terrifying.
Yeah. And I also to touch on sort of the acting and the actors involved, I don't know if there's definitely not another found footage movie, but even just in terms of horror, they're so believable as these characters.
Yeah, that's so we're again not to kind of overlap too much, but what I want to talk about in our found footage podcast is this idea of verisimilitude, where I think it's a very measurable thing in found footage to say how much you believe it. And the players in Blair Witch do an amazing job of making us believe what they're experiencing is real.
And just the idea that they progressively get on each other's nerves so much too. And I mean, and we'll talk about Grave Encounters. I found that to be very, very similar in terms of how it kind of played out. But
for sure.
Yeah, even watching it now, I'm just you believe that they're starting to hate each other.
Even me, who's like I guess I've watched more found footage horror movies than I can count. I don't think a lot of them progress like that, which is interesting. It's always because I think there's kind of different emotions going on in this one, which other found footage movies only kind of have one, which is it's terror, and that kind of makes them one-dimensional. Right. And this one, it has terror, but it also has annoyance, paranoia, blame. They all want to blame Heather, and that becomes its own kind of internal struggle within the narrative itself.
And they're all very different people.
Yes.
Right? They all kind of have this. They bring a very, very unique personality to their role.
For sure, they're not cookie cutter at all. And I think that also attributes to these fake obituaries that were being put out on the internet beforehand. You know, giving you insight deeper into these characters that they're not able to inherently do in a found footage movie, right? Because we're in a found footage movie, we're not able to go into the person's mind, right? What we know is what's said out loud and what's being presented. And I think that the filmmakers did an excellent job using this marketing to not only promote their film, but to build their characters too. Yeah. Which is something I wouldn't say as something that was 100% unique at the time, but even still, I don't think it's being done as well as it was in this instance. And the other thing that's really that when I rewatched that was really capturing me was these locals that they found that are not actors at all. So
Mary
believable. Brown? Yeah, like
Mary Brown's incredible.
Yeah, they're so sincere in the stories. And there's this one shot that I always think of when I'm thinking about this movie that just makes it real for me. And it's just kind of, it's not something significant, but it's the woman that they're interviewing. She's holding her toddler, right? And she's telling them about it, and the toddler starts like crying and asking for something, and she's like, it's not real, and then and then mimes to the camera, yes it is, it's real. That's so real, and it's so true, right? Like that's something that I feel that I'm like, okay, this is something that can definitely it makes her a real person, and because she's a real person, that makes her story real, right. Yeah.
I'm not sure. Do we know? Can we fact check that? Do we know that these people were actors, right? Like
I don't think they were.
Okay.
I mean, they might be like baseline actors. You know, like I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've looked it up, and I'm pretty sure they just walked around the town and said,
it's incredible, right? Because it's like it's still like Blair's reality.
Yeah, for sure.
And fiction. Yeah.
I mean that one lady they go to who is like the harbinger, right? Who tells them, like, you know, don't go into the woods. I've seen, you know, like, I think she was
Mary Brown.
Yeah, Mary Brown. Yeah. So she's obviously I think an actor, but like those like on the street ones, they're definitely I'm pretty sure they just walked around and found people. But hey, correct me if I'm wrong, Twitterverse. I would love to hear it.
Yeah. And there's a Mike and Josh in it, so there you go.
There is. Yeah. I was watching it. I'm like, we should not make any found footage movies in the woods. Yeah. And the other thing about this is it was super real to me because at the time everybody had a camcorder, right? My dad had bought one, I think probably the summer before that came out. And we would run around the house all day and just like, the camcorder was such a cool thing, right? Where you could just pop a tape in there and capture what was happening. So it's another level of just like how these filmmakers were able to identify technologies that were being used at the time,
right?
And different tropes of like what things that scare us, right? Like the urban legends and being caught in the woods, and kind of putting them all together to make this movie. So I think getting back to this question, I don't think it can get better than Blair Witch. Yeah. In terms of found footage, but you know, some people could argue that movies don't get better than Citizen Kane and The Godfather. You know, does that mean the movies can't get better after? Not that can't be good after that. You know.
Yeah, and I think the thing too about the Blair Witch Project is like everything about, because you can say, oh, Citizen Kane, like, you know, it encompasses, it's like the perfect film, quote unquote, right? Like that's how we're taught it in film school, etc. Right. But Blair Witch is such like a product of its, you know, like the marketing, the timing, like everything about it. And you're talking about like camcorders and like everything about it was just like so perfectly timed. And I just don't think that will ever.
Yeah, it was definitely a perfect example of circumstance, and which is something we will be talking about in our found footage genre podcast. So stay tuned for that. So in terms of the movie itself, something that I noticed a lot more this time around that I didn't notice the first few times seeing it, was how much they cut back and forth between the cameras. Because in my mind, there's one camera, right? Like remembering this movie, I'm like, well, they bring a camera into the woods and they try to terrify people, or the filmmakers try to terrify us with this one camera. But there's two cameras going at any time, and they make a point to establish that there are two cameras.
Right.
I think that's something that's really unique and actually adds a lot of depth to this movie, more so than it was before, because you're getting different perspectives now, and. I guess that's something that might be foreshadowing the genre itself, because down the road, like Paranormal Activity and stuff like that, like it's all one camera shows, right? But it's interesting to me that this movie, which we attributed as being one of the first, there's actually two cams, and it gives you a lot of different perspective. So I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Well, are there two, or are there? Because they have the camera that they're shooting the doc with, and that's the 16 mil camera, and then the handy cam.
They have the handy. I'm pretty sure there was two. I think they were using a 16 and a digital camcorder, or a tape recorder, and I'm pretty sure they cut. I think you can tell because the aspect ratios change.
Right, and
they cut back and forth between the two. Yeah, they cut back and forth between the two. Which is also ingenious for the filmmakers too, because those really scary scenes, they have a different, they can give you that black and white blown out trees, which is we so attribute to this movie. It's like an iconic picture. Those like blown out white trees in the dark of the sky because of the lights that they're showing.
Right.
And they can cut that back and forth between this this like handheld camcorder footage, and it's really striking.
I was thinking too about the iconic scene where Heather turns the camera on herself.
Yep.
And it's like that scene is still so visceral, right? Like you're seeing
for sure.
her snot bubbles and stuff. Like it's really, really intense. And I was like, is this like the first selfie in a movie?
Oh, that'd be interesting. That'd certainly be interesting to look at that. And it's so successful too, because like, think about it. There's nothing to that shot, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing to it. It's not framed or lit well, right?
Right.
Because
and it's not probably one of the most iconic shots in horror, probably of all time.
Yeah, I would argue probably is that.
Yeah.
I would put it right up next to Max Schreck's shadow creeping up the stairs, right? It's just something we identify so much with horror, and it's nothing. Like it's just a static shot, and it really comes. I'm gonna get a little filmy on you for a second.
Go
because we're all filmies here, right? There's a French film theorist named Andre Bazin, and in some of his writings he talks about how. So he brings it back to this documentary called Kon-Tiki. And if you've never seen it, it's about a group of Scandinavian researchers who believe that there are similarities between artifacts found in Africa, in the west coast of Africa and the east coast of South America. So they have a theory that these natives built boats and sailed across that immense gap, and they want to test it. So these scientists build their own raft and they try to get across the ocean. And it's a very famous documentary. It came out in the 50s, I believe. And there's a scene in the documentary where there's a shark attack. And so all they have are these handheld 16 millimeter cameras, right? Because that's actually, it might have been Super 8 at that point. And the video fades out, and and a title card reads, "The film was damaged. There was a shark attack." And Andre Bazin makes this argument that this makes that real. That makes that more real than seeing the shark, because we're seeing the results of it literally on the screen, and our mind is able to make that so much more real than if they were to show the shark attack, right? And it brings us to this higher level of cinematic experience where what we're watching is now being reflected in the real world, right? And that's a bit cerebral when it comes to the casual horror fan, but I see that all over this movie. Yeah, and I can't believe that's a coincidence. I'm sure these filmmakers were at least in some way thinking about that.
Yeah,
and especially the one scene that always comes to mind is when their tents are finally, they're getting shaken, and they start running out of the tent, and she screams, "Oh my God, what's that up on the hill?" And you're like, turn the camera,
Show us the thing on the hill. Yeah.
And they don't turn the camera.
Yeah.
And that makes it so much more real to me than seeing someone in a costume, Like, it's so much more real when they don't show, frankly, what their limitations were, right?
Yeah.
The fact that they're able to live inside this bubble of constraint is fantastic. Like, it just gives it so much more, what I call verisimilitude. It gives it so much more reality, because if I was behind that camera, I wouldn't have turned to look at it either. I'd be running straight ahead, and that's what makes it real to me.
Yeah, and that's interesting too. I know we keep touching on other found footage films, but I think that the strength in Blair Witch is exactly that, and I think found footage horror has strayed so far from that, where you're seeing everything now at this point, and like, maybe I don't want to see that shit,
So I gave you a list of found footage movies to watch, like a lot of them, so I understand if you didn't get to them. This wasn't even on that list. It's not bad, so props to these filmmakers, because they did make a good film really cheap. It's called Survive the Horror Shoals, and it's a Blair Witch tribute. It's about this guy who wants to do a 40 or probably 62-month, 60-day wilderness challenge where he lives in the wilderness, and he brings a camcorder, he sets up a little tent and stuff, or he builds a shelter out of like trees. Things start happening outside in the woods, right? And so he starts setting up his camera at night, and I was enjoying the movie, but they show a lot. Like, they show what looks like a woman in a white dress sneaking around outside, and we're supposed to think that that's a spirit. Right. And the movie is good. It's very enjoyable, but stuff like that takes me out of that experience, right? Because like, as much as you want to see, you really don't. And that's what makes it more scary, right? Yeah.
And even that last shot is still one of the scarier things that I've seen.
That last shot is, I'm glad we kind of came there eventually. Obviously, we knew we would, but that last shot is truly terrifying. Yeah. They obviously set it up really well in the beginning, where they, they're like, he would bring two kids down to the basement, and say that you would live if you don't look, right? As I was watching it, I'm thinking to myself, that setup makes no sense at all. Like, why would a person do that? It doesn't have to, right? Because it's so terrifying.
The payoff is just so good. Yeah.
And even still, like, even as I'm watching it, it kind of stays in the back of your mind. And I think even the first time I'd seen it, I was like, that. Even as a kid, I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. I would just run away, and why would this person bring me down? Like, I think even as a kid, I knew that. But then you get there, right? And then you see it, and you're like, you're as frozen as Mike is in the corner, right? Like, you are as frozen because because you see it, and in that split second, you know what's going to happen, and you're terrified, and you can't move. So you're put in that scenario,
and then it just ends, and it's just over. It's just like so abrupt, and I love it. I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember at the time people complaining of like feeling nauseous and people throwing up at the theater. Yeah.
I didn't feel that way at all. I didn't either. I wonder if we don't feel that way because we're so used to it at this point, with all of the different kinds of found footage that come behind it, or that came after it, and like the just GoPro footage all over the internet. I wonder if we're like more immune to it now than
probably.
They were
but
back then.
I don't even remember feeling nauseous at the theater.
Yeah, I don't remember either.
But it's in line with The Exorcist, right? Like people would like throw up at The Exorcist.
Yeah, for sure. We might just be really non-susceptible. Like, I'm sure we'll put this out there and people will be like, it makes me sick to this day.
It still does, yeah. I still can't watch it.
It still makes me sick. But there's a really great quote that I wrote down. At this point, the characters are trapped in the woods, and they're not completely hopeless yet, but they're getting there. And I think it's Josh. He takes the camera from Heather, who's typically holding it, and he says something like, I can see why you like this camera. It's like a totally filtered reality. It's like you can pretend everything's not quite the way it is. And I found that incredibly profound for a movie that's about people getting trapped in the woods, right?
Yeah.
Like, not to take anything away from horror, because us horror heads know that it's the best kind of storytelling, but it's just not a line that you would expect in this kind of movie. And I found it just amazingly put, and such an interesting reflection of what's happening to these characters at the time that it's happening. I don't know if that caught your attention, but it definitely caught mine.
It didn't actually, but yeah, now that you mentioned that, that's like an interesting sort of meta commentary on, what
sure.
they were experiencing, and just filmmaking in general, I think, too.
So did you ever have a Lost in the Woods experience that this, because you said you had a cabin or something that you would go to, like a summer cabin or something? Was that in like the woods? Did you ever like have this kind of experience? Not obviously were you ever chased by a supernatural ghost in the middle of the woods, but that must have been scary seeing that and then going to those places.
Yeah, so that technically was in the woods. It was like a lakeside sort of cabin that I'd grown up going to. That was in the family. Not nearly as like scary as like something that would be like like put you right in the middle of like a wooded environment. But we told a lot of ghost stories when we were there. That's for sure. I know that. Yeah. How about you? Anything in particular? I've had some really scary moments, like camping.
Yeah,
just because I get in my own head, but like,
yeah, I was gonna say, I wasn't very woodsy when I was a kid, so there was a level of separation between me and the story, which I think that is what made me safe. Like that's kind of why I loved it so much. Was like, okay, that's good. That's happening to these people, because that will not be happening to me. My dad was really poor growing up, and he grew up in the woods. So his family had a shack in the woods, and he would tell me about all these experiences of him living in the woods as a kid. So he wanted nothing to do with that by the time he was an adult. And so it was only when I started to camp myself as an old person, where I would go out in the woods. And it's wild that this film came out in 1999, and it's still the first thing that I think of every time.
Every time you go camping?
Every time I go camping. Is
amazing.
Blair Witch, yeah.
Talk about influence, right? Like,
yeah, because it really holds up the test of time, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about Blair Witch, and I think it's safe to say that what we feel is that this is a film that I don't think is ever going to be topped as the greatest found footage movie, but I think it's so influential and has spawned a lot of spin-offs, replications, and
nightmares.
Nightmares for sure. Right here on Nightmare Network.
Yes, indeed.
But I think it's undeniable that this film is iconic. It holds a true place in the history of American cinema, and it honestly changed the game completely when it comes to viral marketing, how we tell our stories, how we build our characters, and how we get those screams. Especially for all of those, horror hopefuls out there who think that they need a set amount of money for a makeup artist or for VFX or for anything. And you can even see right here on Nightmare Network, once we start releasing our short films, I think a goal of ours was we wanted to try to do this with that Blair Witch spirit, making the scares as authentic as we could without relying too heavily on things we honestly couldn't afford, because we're just two guys who want to make movies, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, that's I guess that's kind of my closing thoughts. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, no, you nailed it. I was just thinking to myself, like, I don't know if I knew what the hell marketing was before this movie either, and now it's everywhere. Like marketing and virality on the internet, and like. It's that, like, that's sort of the culture that we live in.
They're synonymous now, right?
Yeah, exactly.
At the end of the day, films were always a product, right? And it was a product that needed to be sold. We as film historians and theorists like to believe that there's a pure artistic function to it, and for sure, for certain auteurs they are. But at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to keep making them if you don't make money, right? Yeah. And I think that this really changed the game for storytelling, And I think it kind of offered a bridge to creativity and marketing in terms of your narrative, right? It would be interesting to see how closely marketing was to films in terms of narrative before this, right? Because now we have movies like Blade Runner 2049 where they're making advertisements that you need to watch in order to understand the full story, right?
Yeah.
Like if you walk into that blind, you're like, who's Jared Leto again? And someone next to you is gonna whisper like, oh, did you watch the featurette that was on this? You know, so. Yep. This is normal now. This marketing for narrative craft is normal, and as far as I can tell, this is where it started.
Yep. Yeah. And and now everybody's got a camera that they can just pull out of their pocket and shoot with. And I think it still holds the Guinness World Record for the most money made compared to the money that they spent.
I did look this up. It still holds the box office ratio record.
Ratio record. That's it. Yeah. Incredible stuff.
Or Paranormal Activity might have overthrown it, but even still, where do you think Paranormal Activity came from? You know what I mean?
Yeah, there would be no Paranormal Activity without Blair Witch. So
for sure, and I think the beautiful thing about this is there's still found footage movies being made. You know, people like to say the genre's tired. I certainly don't think so, and you can hear us talk about that on our found footage genre podcast.
You subtweeting me?
little subtweet. Which is a great way to end this one. All you filmmakers out there, if you want to make something scary, grab your camera and go get lost in the woods. Okay, don't do that one, but go grab your camera and make something scary. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mike.
I'm Josh.
And thanks for tuning in to our Nightmare Revisited. Thanks for listening to the Nightmare Network podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't be afraid to give us suggestions on movies that spooked you out for our next episode. You can visit nightmarenetworkofficial.com to submit your own nightmare to be adapted into a short film on our YouTube channel. As always, at Nightmare Network, you share your scares.